points that the previous authors have kind of alluded to in my talk. There's going to be a little bit of social psychology theory and methods to begin with, and then we'll try to blend in some of the visual stuff you guys were talking about, and the trash and the Native American is actually going to come up later. So, but anyway, so my topic today is looking at the illegal wildlife trade and ways in which social influence methods in theory can be utilized and implemented within social marketing framework to help reduce demand for these products. So most often, policy management to deal with the illegal wildlife trade is going to focus primarily on increasing law enforcement or enforcement of regulations and to some extent monitoring. But a lot of scholars have recently advocated that we need to look more at efforts that reduce demand and efforts that engage with local communities. And so it's these last 2 points that are going to underlie my talk today. And what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to think about consumers, less about poachers. So think more about the people buying these products, buying these animals or the derivatives of these animals, and sort of ask, why are they doing it? How can we influence them not to? And sort of other interactions and other aspects of the socio-cultural context that are influencing them. So what this is going to help us do is it's going to help us frame this as a behavior problem. And so what I'm going to introduce is some of those theory and methods that we can use to appropriately understand, examine, and sort of change human behavior in this context. So the idea is that a lot of the, as I mentioned, reducing demand, so these social drivers of illegal wildlife trade have sort of become in vogue now, and so we're trying to look at ways in which we can deal with these. So we wanted to look at ways in which social influence approaches were utilized in campaigns or programs or strategies. And so we initially set out to do a review of these strategies in the context of the illegal wildlife trade, but we subsequently didn't find very much. So we sort of made this into more of a call for action, and so that's what I'm going to try to do today, is sort of introduce you to some of the theory-based ways in which this can be approached, and then social marketing as a way to implement that. And then hopefully if you guys have any questions or interest in this, chat with me during our break or afterwards. So to sort of initially begin with into sort of the theory of social influence, it's this inherent aspect of human nature that we are influenced by others around us. How others are behaving or how we perceive them to be behaving or what we observe them to be doing. And so this is going to be one of the reasons why we act and why we think the way we do sometimes, or most often is the case. And so today, while there are going to be various perspectives on the antecedents to behavior, some of them have probably been mentioned in other talks, but what we want to do today is think socially and think about yourself in situations where you've bought maybe luxury items or something you didn't really need, and maybe ask, why did I do that? Or why do you have some of the same things that your friends or neighbors or family have? And kind of think about it that way. And I understand that some of you might be unfamiliar with this area of study, so right now I'm going to introduce some of the mechanisms of social influence and why social influence affects behavior and why it shapes our behavior in a lot of different ways. So first is the idea that I brought up in the previous slide, is that the perceptions of others' behaviors or our observations of their behavior or our beliefs of their expectations or approval or their what they might be thinking is appropriate behavior does influence our behavior. And so social norms is one of the big things that you guys are probably familiar with. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. I'm also going to talk a little bit about social comparison and this idea of social learning, all within this sort of realm of social cognitive theory. And next is the idea that behavior is influenced by its consequences, so these social consequences, so rewards or punishments, so incentives that we get from other people. So this is the idea of a group reference, so some groups that you're part of, simply as family, friends, coworkers, or societies of conservation biology, or things like that, they have certain behaviors or ways of behaving that are proscribed or prescribed so that you act in certain ways in accordance with that. And that deals a lot with social identity. And then lastly is sort of this idea of socialization, that behavior is influenced by direct and repeated experience. So it's not necessarily direct or repeated experience doing the behavior, but also the idea that direct and repeated experience of these rewards or punishments, so social sanctions that we call them sometimes. So these are sort of the mechanisms of social influence. And so now I want to sort of introduce some of the tools of social influence, or the methods of social influence that we study and utilize to initiate or affect behavior change. And so what I'm going to introduce are sort of 4 different social influence methods. These are derived from a meta-analysis that found these to be the 4 most effective ways. There were 6, and these are 4 of those 6. And so in the context of the illegal wildlife trade, I'm going to look at some messaging frames that you guys were just kind of speaking to with the visuals and the messages that we see in those visuals and how we interpret those. And then I'm going to look at some face-to-face sort of interaction stuff that sort of blends into social marketing that I was talking about earlier. And so what I'm going to try to do is kind of explain what we were doing and then kind of make a call for these strategies and approaches to be utilized within the illegal wildlife trade campaigns. But a lot of the examples I'm going to utilize are from pro-environmental health and consumer behavior. So as we walk through this, we're going to have a lot of visuals, so hopefully that doesn't distract you from what I'm saying, but actually these are very interesting to what you guys were just talking about, because a lot of times it's as she was mentioning, the imagery of the Native American and the trash and everything like that is what we would call a descriptive norm. So that is the idea that trash, waste is very, very common. And so, so that's the social norm. No one recycles. That's the image that you get a lot of times. But social norms are sort of those informal rules or beliefs about what behavior is appropriate, but also what behavior is common. So it's these 2 dimensions of a descriptive norm and an injunctive norm that are really, really powerful within imagery or within messaging campaigns. And a lot of times they're utilized here, like in university campuses. We have students, they try to tell you, your students don't drink very often. They're trying to tell you that your fellow students don't drink very often, or that they don't commit violent acts or domestic violence. And then in the realm of pro-environmental behaviors, we utilize injunctive norms here, so that approval or expectation of behavior. This is actually from my work in Texas on my dissertation, so we're looking at the effectiveness and interpretation of different sort of normative messaging campaigns. And then here is one that they do in Illinois with the Be a Hero, Transport Zero, the same thing, trying to stop aquatic invaders. And so they use a descriptive norm of saying 95% of boaters protect waters with doing these behaviors. But during our review, we found that in the illegal wildlife trade, this isn't really utilized very often. And so these are some of the imagery, some of the images that we found that were akin to it, but not necessarily utilizing the social influence or the social normative theory to sort of affect what people are interpreting or what they're seeing. Because very much like the recycling one, this one tells you that the wildlife trade is the 4th most lucrative, illegal trade in the world. Yes, it's as illegal, but it's as lucrative too. So, and then on this other side, again, to reiterate, we're talking about demand today. So this image here is talking, it's telling you that the supply here is the foundation, where a lot of research is telling us that these guys here at the top of the pyramid, people's wants of these products, the people who are seeking them out, are really driving what these guys are doing on the ground. And so, moving on, so social norms it's my area of research. It's something I'm very, very keen on talking to you guys about later, the speakers or anyone else. But I want to move on to sort of social comparison, and this is something that you guys are probably very closely or have some direct experience seeing. Social comparison refers to the idea that I'm looking at myself and comparing what I'm doing or my opinions or my status in the social hierarchy to others. And in the illegal wildlife trade markets, or a lot of times in luxury item markets, it's this upward social comparison that is really important. People that I perceive as better off than myself, what are they doing and what are they buying and what are they wearing? So a lot of the marketing and ads utilize that. So watches, for some reason, utilize it a lot. But in the illegal wildlife trade, it's not actually used. But what is used are the social comparison mechanisms, not necessarily in the ad campaigns or anything like that, but what is actually happening on the ground. So Rebecca Drury did her dissertation on some of this stuff in Vietnam and found that the bushmeat or the wild meat consumption was predominantly a mechanism of communicating prestige or obtaining social leverage. So young professionals in Vietnam would be consuming bushmeat because the people higher tier in their jobs or something were doing the same thing. And so that's where they wanted to be. And so not necessarily just bushmeat consumption, but other behaviors as well were included in that. But what we get in the wildlife trade is we get images of people buying high-end ivory carvings, or that's Rihanna, the pop star with a slow reef. And we have tiger wine and civet coffee and songbirds in Indonesia. And another big one is the bushmeat consumption, which is probably one of the better studied areas. Sorry, not to ramble on, but to the next one is, those are all sort of the messaging and information provisioning frameworks, so how you can utilize that. And then the next ones are these face-to-face that are utilized a lot in conservation or community-based conservation. That's going to lead into social marketing. Public commitments are pretty straightforward. You know, someone comes out and says, hey, I'm not going to do this, or I'm going to do this. And so what this does is sort of aligns your expressed attitude or belief with your behavior. And in the wildlife trade market, we found that a lot of times it's not really a face-to-face thing, it's more distanced. We have Wild Aid and their shark fin soup pledges, and Wild Aid just in general does a lot of global pledges and ambassadors of celebrities and local celebrities in these countries saying they're not going to do something or join me and say no. And so we found that, you know, while they're still using this social influence of public commitments, it's not really being implemented on the ground in these face-to-face interactions, which sort of leads into this block leader approach, which is utilized a lot in pro-environmental behaviors to initiate recycling or energy or water conservation in neighborhoods. And it's also one of the big things that we found is the rare pride campaigns and education for Vietnam are two of the big players in the wildlife trade that do utilize public or social influence via a block leader approach and a social marketing approach. And so to sort of the hard turn into social marketing, I just want to say that I'm not a social marketer, I'm trying to be one, and there's a few people around at this conference that are as well, that are doing this type of thing. But the idea with social marketing is the idea that we can implement these things and then we can evaluate them. And that's been sort of a theme for today, or this week's conference, is sort of this evidence or this evaluation of what is effective or successful. And so while social influence wasn't utilized heavily in the wildlife trade to stymie reduction of demand, it was necessary for us to sort of look at a way in which we could provide people with the idea that social influence and social norms are going to affect behavior, but then give them some way to implement it. And so social marketing and conservation marketing is one of those ways in which people can do it. And as you can see, it's very similar to a lot of other things that we talk about or utilize within conservation in general. Adaptive management is the same sort of idea. Open standards for practice is another one. And then in the pro-environmental behavior realm, there's the community-based social marketing. And then again, the rare pride campaigns, marketing for conservation. And then a recent paper came out with theory for change directly tied into the wildlife trade. But the point of my talk today, as I ramble on, is that people are the problem. Human behavior is how we're going to change these issues that we have in conservation. And that's one of the themes of this conference, motivating action. And so a lot of people are sort of veering in that direction or headed towards that direction. And I just want to reiterate that the idea that social influences and we ourselves can do what we need to do in terms of influencing others to initiate conservation action. And my co-author on this paper, Elizabeth Dowd, is here as well. She's an expert in the wildlife trade. And if you guys want to chat with us later, please do. Thank you.